I posted a video recently where I demonstrate learning a SZA song by ear in about 30 seconds. And one commenter didn't believe it was possible, but it's absolutely possible. And actually, professional musicians just take it for granted that everyone can do this. You don't need perfect pitch to be able to play by ear. In fact, I do not have perfect pitch. Even after all these years of playing piano, I cannot reliably sing middle C without a reference pitch. Totally wrong. But I can learn songs by ear in 1 or 2 listens. To do that, I use the same 3-step process I've been using since I was a teenager. I've gotten a lot better at the process over time, but the 3 steps have remained the same. So I want to show you those 3 steps. We'll apply them to a few example songs and look at how, as your ear improves over time, that process will gradually change. For our first example song, let's use Cruel Summer by Taylor Swift. It'll sound like this. So our 3 steps are simple. Find the key, find the bass line, find the chords. Let's look at how this plays out if you're new to playing by ear. To find the key, you can basically just use trial and error. Now, you will need to know your major scales. So if you already aren't familiar with your major scales, you can grab my visual guide to all the major scales, and I do have some other videos on how to practice your scales. So in the early stages, you're going to rely heavily on trial and error. And if you're coming from playing classical music or tutorials, the first thing to get used to is the idea that you're not going to break the instrument if you play wrong notes. I encourage you to just kind of make a mess. Don't worry about playing something wrong. And you can play along with the recording and just start to listen for notes that sound like they fit. Pretty soon you'll start to gather a little collection of notes that all feel like they really belong with this song. And even people with really untrained ears tend to be pretty good at this. If you're hearing a chord progression that goes like this note is going to sound really out of place. Let's say I'm pretty confident that all 4 of these notes sound good with Cruel Summer. A, B, C sharp, and E. That's only 4 notes, but I've already ruled out most of the possible major keys. There are only 3 keys that include all 4 of those notes. A major, D major, and E major. So now that I have some guesses about what key this might be in, I can try playing those major scales along with the recording or immediately after listening to part of the recording. And one might stick out to me as really feeling like it belongs with the song. You're listening for a sense of resolution, that when you play the scale and you arrive at the top of the scale, that also sounds like that could be the ending of this song. Often a really great giveaway for the sound of the key of the song is the end of a phrase or the end of the song, because that's where things are likely to sound resolved, and a lot of times songwriters end things on the 1 chord. Let's say I've arrived at A as the key that I think we're in for Cruel Summer. That makes the rest of my job much easier. Because here, as we go to step 2, finding the bass line, we can always just start with the notes that belong in the key as our reasonable guesses. There are times in pop music where the bass line will go outside the key, but they're relatively uncommon. So we've narrowed our guesses down from 12 possible pitches for each of those bass notes to just 7 that belong in the scale. And now we listen for the bass line. We're listening for where it sounds like the chords are changing, and right at the beginning of that new chord change, listen for the lowest note that you can hear. 2 things can really help with this. Use the best headphones or speakers that you have, because if you're using just like a phone speaker, it will actually cut out a lot of those lower frequencies. So it doesn't matter how good your ear is. If you're trying to listen on an iPhone speaker, you might not be able to hear the bass notes of the recording. Another tip is to play these bass notes when you're testing your guesses in a bass register. Play them low on your instrument. Sometimes melody notes are different than bass notes, and they can even rub against bass notes if you play the bass notes too high on your instrument. For example, the last bass note in this Taylor Swift example is a D, and we have C sharp in the melody exactly when that bass note lands. So if you're testing the bass note up here, you might even be correct about the bass note. You think it might be a D, but because the melody is on a C sharp, it sounds wrong. So make sure you're testing out these bass notes in a low register. Listen for the lowest note you can hear as you move from one chord to the next. And especially if you're new to this, I suggest you go ahead and write these down. As you find a bass note and you feel confident about it, write it down. In Cruel Summer, we have A, C sharp, F sharp, and D. And those are the 4 bass notes we hear in the chorus chord progression. Once we've written down those bass notes and we know the key of the song, again, we've made our job a lot easier by narrowing the possibilities. For each of those bass notes, there are only a couple likely chords that will go with the note. So for A, if we're in the key of A major, it's probably gonna be an A major chord. And at this point, you can just test your guess and play it along with the song and see if it sounds right. For all the rest of these bass notes, you should start with your guess being the diatonic chord. That is the chord that only uses notes that belong in the scale. So for C sharp, that's the 3rd note of the scale. We should try a minor chord first. For F sharp, that's the 6th. That's also usually going to be minor. And for D, that's 4, and that's usually a major chord. In the case of this example song, those chords are all correct. So your first guess, even without having heard the song, if you just looked at all those bass notes, your first guess based on the key of the song would be correct. That's the power of knowing the key of a song. So at this point, we know the chord progression to Cruel Summer. It's A, C sharp minor, F sharp minor, and D. And if you want to go on and, as a bonus, find the melody on the piano, you can do that too, basically using the same process we used for finding the bass notes. You know, you're limiting your guesses to notes that do belong in the scale as a great starting point. And just don't be afraid to use trial and error. Okay, so the first few dozen times you try doing this, you might need to rely really heavily on trial and error. The next stage of development is starting to rely more on your ear apart from the instrument and be able to hear what's going on before you test things. Let's use a new example song for this. Let's use Vampire by Olivia Rodrigo. That sounds like this. Now we're going to try and find the sound of 1, the sound of the key of the song, before we even test anything on the piano. So I'm going to try and sing a note that sounds like it's resolved, that sounds like it could be the end of the song. Ba. That note sounds like it could be the end of the song. Another note could maybe be ba. That note also sounds pretty stable. And in fact, most people will do a pretty good job of generally singing either 1 or 5, the 1st or 5th notes of a major scale, when they're looking for a note that sounds like it's resolved. Sometimes people will be led astray by a melody note that's different than the 1 or the 5. Our ear tends to just gravitate towards what we're hearing in the melody. But if you can listen for the end of a phrase or the end of the song, a lot of times you'll be able to hear what sounds like the most resolved note. So just practice trying to sing 1. And this might seem really hard at first, but you're actually probably better than you think at recognizing the sound of what is resolved in a piece of music. If you hear a piece like this, and then you hear a note or a chord that doesn't belong in the key, you'll probably recognize that it sounds weird or it sounds wrong. And the flip side of that is that you're probably pretty good at recognizing when something sounds like it does belong or it's the natural ending to the piece. So you have likely been hearing the sound of 1 your whole life. We're just trying to put a name to it and get you to be able to sing it after hearing a piece of music. Now, when you're first doing this, you might not be confident at all that you're singing 1 correctly, but you can test for yourself whether you're right. And again, this is where we'll use our knowledge of scales on the piano. If I think ba is 1 for Vampire, then I'm going to try finding that note on piano. Ba. I'll just sing until I can match that pitch with the piano. And then now I think it might be an F. I'm going to play the F major scale. And just as we did in the easy version, we'll listen for whether that scale sounds like it belongs with the piece. The most common mistake is mistaking 5 for 1, and there will be one note that's wrong if you choose that scale. So in this case, 5 would be ba, a C in the key of F, and this note does not belong with the piece. So that'll be your giveaway if you choose 5 instead of 1 for what you think is the root note of the song. One other tip that has helped some of my students with this is you can try singing 1 and then singing a few notes in the scale in either direction. Ba, I think that's 1. Can I sing 2, 3, 2, 1, 7, 6, 7, 1, 5, 1. If you can sort of sing your way around a major scale on either side of what you think is the root note, you can listen for whether that feels like it makes sense with the sound of the song. So that's step 1 at an intermediate level. Listen to the song, see if you can sing the root, and then find that note on the piano. And that's how you'll find the key of the song. For step 2 at an intermediate level, we're finding the bass notes, but we're going to try and do it more by ear, and we'll do that with scale degrees. So this is called functional ear training. We get situated in a certain key, and then we're identifying notes with numbers. There's an app, a free app that I highly recommend for this. It's called Functional Ear Trainer. And you can also practice this skill by practicing taking simple melodies and putting them in lots of different keys. Sight singing is another great way to practice this skill. This is basically the skill of solfege, movable do, solfege, learning to recognize notes within a key by their numbers. So that's the intermediate level of listening for bass lines. Without testing on the instrument, you're going to try and listen for that bass note. Again, use headphones or great speakers, and you're just going to be hearing numbers. So in the case of this Olivia Rodrigo song, I would hear 1, 3, 4, and then another kind of 4. And that's how I would find that bass line. In the key of F, those numbers will be F, A, and B flat twice. And again, for step 3, at an intermediate level, you can start to push yourself to identify the kind of chord associated with each of these bass notes before you test on the instrument. And you can rely on your theory knowledge to narrow your guesses down. Probably the 1 chord is major. Probably the 3 chord is minor. Probably the 4 chord is major. In the case of this song, 2 of those chords actually are non-diatonic. That means they use a chord quality other than the one in the song. But look, when the 3 is in the bass, it's usually either minor or major. And it's actually fairly common in pop songs for the 3 to be used as a major chord or a dominant chord. So over time, you'll start to recognize the difference between the sound of a 3 minor chord and a 3 major chord. And in this case, when I hear that 3 in the bass, I can recognize that it has that sort of strong pull upward that a 3 chord played as a major chord has. You'll have to do trial and error to get good at this, but over time you'll start to recognize the way that these different chord functions sound when they're either major or minor. And there just aren't that many different options for possible chords over any of these possible bass notes. Usually the first options are either major or minor, and you should start with the ones that make sense in the key of the song. And then maybe you can branch out from there to other chord qualities like inversions of chords or 7th chords and so on. But usually in pop music, you really only have to look at those first couple most likely guesses for the chord functions to figure out what kind of chord it is once you know the bass note. So with this Olivia Rodrigo song, we know that the bass notes are 1, 3, 4, and another 4. And my ear is very familiar with the sound of 1 as a major chord, 3 as a major chord, 4 as a major chord, and then 4 becoming a minor chord. So as you're getting better and better at doing this, I suggest you push yourself to make a guess for each of these chord functions before you test them on the piano. You might have already found out that the song is in the key of F, but try and write down, okay, do I think this is a 3 major chord or a 3 minor chord? And write down your guesses. And then you can test and get feedback by trying these things on the piano and seeing whether they sound right. Now, speaking from personal experience here, I did this for a long time before I started to get to the place where I could hear chord progressions as numbers and feel really confident about my guesses without testing at the instrument. But that will start to happen if you keep practicing this for a number of years. And when that started to happen, there was this kind of amazing thing that happened in my life where suddenly, as I was going about my day, just hearing music, I knew what I was hearing. The interesting thing is that if you have relative pitch, you'll be hearing everything as numbers, and the numbers might be accurate. But if I'm visualizing those numbers being played on a piano keyboard, I'm not actually confident about what key it's in. So a lot of times I might be visualizing playing a song in the wrong key with all of the numbers correct. So like going back to that Taylor Swift song, if I were to hear that song and not have a piano nearby, I might think, well, maybe the song's in C, and I'll be hearing everything as... So you can hear, that's the song. It sounds correct, but it's in the wrong key. And so at a certain point, as I got better at doing this, that's basically what started happening in my head just as I walked around and moved through the world and listened to music. I was constantly automatically visualizing these songs on a piano keyboard in my head, but it was kind of a roll of the dice whether it was the correct key. And then if I found myself near a piano, I could figure out the key of the song and immediately transpose all those numbers into the correct key. So let's use one more example song and look at how that plays out. So here's the introduction to From the Start by Leve. Now, when I hear that chord progression, I know what it is. It's a 2-5-1. I don't know what key it's in, but I know that 1 is here. Bum. And I recognize the chord progression because I've learned so many songs in this style that often use this kind of 2-5-1 with these kind of chord extensions. It's a minor 9 chord, dominant 13 chord, and major 7 chord. You will definitely find this, that the more songs you learn in a certain style, the easier it is to recognize chord progressions that belong in that style. So if I hear a song like this Leve song, I know what the numbers are, and I might even be imagining the song in my head in some key. Maybe I'd be imagining it in the key of F major. It's not until I get to a piano keyboard that I can play a reference pitch, and then I know exactly what notes are being played. And the way that that reference pitch thing works once you're really comfortable with this is that you can just discretely play a single note. And if you've just been listening to the recording or the recording's playing, you can hear where that note lives within the key of the song. In this case, if I played a C and the song goes like that, C is the 7th scale degree in the key of D flat major. And so I play this, I go, ooh, that's 7. That means we must be in D flat. So you can get really good at this, and this is where relative pitch starts to be almost indistinguishable from perfect pitch because you can be really sneaky about your reference pitch. And I got a lot of practice with this when I used to accompany a church congregation in South LA. Sometimes they would just start singing things a cappella, and I would have no idea what key they were in, but I'd need to figure it out really quick. So I'd play a reference pitch, hear where it fit in the key that they were singing in, and then I'd launch in and whatever they were singing, I would find a way to accompany them. So this is the most advanced level of the sort of step 1 part of this 3-step process, finding the key of the song. You're going to get really comfortable with latching onto the sound of 1 for whatever song you're listening to. And then all you need in terms of a reference is 1 note, compare it to the sound of 1 in the key of the song, and you'll be able to find what key you need to be in. And then the rest of the process, steps 1 through 3, kind of get folded into one really fast thing that all happens in your ear once you get good at this. So when I'm just like listening to the radio, when it's music with relatively simple harmony, this kind of happens automatically in my head. I'm hearing where the bass is and I'm assigning numbers to things. I've had students who have started getting good at doing this and told me that they're getting annoyed by the fact that they can't turn it off. And I actually remember there was a phase I went through where I was starting to get really good at doing this in college, and I did find it almost interfered with my enjoyment of listening to music, that I was just constantly like what are the numbers? I was listening to everything to find the numbers. But the good news is that you'll move through that phase. If you get to where every time you listen to music, you're trying to ID numbers and hear the chord progression, it will start to become so automatic that even if you can't stop yourself from doing that, it will just be happening in the background, and you can still go back to listening to music very passively and just enjoying what you're hearing and not treating everything as an ear training exercise. So I hope this helps. None of this is easy. It all takes a lot of patience. But if you have the patience and you put in the effort, learning to play by ear is something that is available to every musician. And it's such an amazing skill to have. It's really freeing to know that regardless of the piece of music, if you hear something you're like, you're going to be able to figure it out on your instrument. There's a lot I didn't cover in this video. There are other areas of ear training, like learning to separate out the timbres of different instruments, or the sort of, fine pitch hearing that we often don't even really develop as a pianist, but I've really had to work on in the past couple of years as I've started learning violin. We also didn't touch on minor scales or other modes or scales at all, and you will come across those even in popular music, but it's a great place to start just focusing on the major scale, because I'd say 80 to 90% of pop songs are built around the major scale or some sort of major tonality. And that's it. My name is Ted. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more tutorials like this. If you have any questions on today's lesson, let me know in the comments. And in the meantime, happy practicing.